Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you. I'm Alan Solomont. I'm the Dean of the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts University. I want to welcome you to the Tisch College's Distinguished Speaker Series tonight, featuring former United States Senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, and moderated by Tufts Professor of Political Science, Debbie Schildkraut. I want to acknowledge tonight's co-sponsors, the Office of the Provost, and it's great to welcome the Provost, who's over there in the cheap seats. Also, the Political Science Department and Tufts Republicans. I want to thank you all for your support and collaboration. I also want to give a warm welcome to Cheryl Flake. Senator Flake's wife is with us tonight. We're delighted you could join us as well. This is the second of our Distinguished Speaker Series of the spring term. We hosted Democratic political strategist Donna Brazil 2 weeks ago. And next month, on April 1st, we will join the Tufts chaplaincy to present author and interfaith leader Ibo Patel. I hope you'll join us for these talks as well as for other events, which you can find on the Tisch College website. At Tisch College, we take great pride in bringing to campus leaders from across the political spectrum, from many other arenas, to engage with the Tufts community in thoughtful conversation about the issues that shape our world. It's an important part of our mission to ensure that all Tufts students are informed and engaged citizens who are prepared to solve common problems, participate in civic life, and help to strengthen our democracy. And we're proud to continue to grow Tisch College's educational opportunities, research initiatives, and community partnerships in pursuit of this mission. Just last week, we announced a new Tisch College program, the Tufts Civic Semester, which will allow incoming students to spend their first semester of college abroad in Peru or China, combining academic work with community service at a nonprofit organization. Our research continues to shape policy and the national conversation about young people's civic and political participation. This work ranges from helping to craft groundbreaking legislation that will require civics to be taught in every Massachusetts school, to informing presidential candidates about the power of the youth vote. We also put that what we teach and what we learn into practice, creating opportunities for students, faculty, and community partners to work together on important issues. Our guest tonight understands the value of public service and civic engagement and of working with others, even those with whom he may disagree, in order to solve problems and to move this country forward. Jeff Flake is a former United States Senator from Arizona who served in the Senate from 2013 until earlier this year. Senator Flake has long been committed to serving others. As a student at Brigham Young University, he took a 2-year leave to serve as a missionary in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And after college, he returned to Africa as director of the Foundation for Democracy in Namibia during that nation's transition to independence. Back in the United States, Senator Flake was the executive director of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona before running for Congress. The senator was first elected to the United States House of Representatives in 2000. He served 6 terms in that chamber, during which time he was a member of the influential House Appropriations Committee. In 2012, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he served on the Foreign Relations, Judiciary, Aging, and Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Throughout his time in Congress, Senator Flake was known for his willingness to work across the aisle and, when necessary, to buck his own party. He was one of the Republican House leaders in the successful effort to eliminate earmarks from the appropriations process, and he was one of the lead Senate Republicans to advocate for the normalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba. He was also a member of the so-called Gang of Eight that passed comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate, only to see it die in the House. In recent years, Senator Flake has become widely known as a vocal critic of President Trump. He laid out many of these criticisms in his book, Conscience of a Conservative, a Rejection of Destructive Politics and A Return to Principle, which he published in August of 2017. And I read it last week, and I recommend it to all of you. When he announced that he would not run for re-election to the United States Senate, he delivered an impassioned speech on the Senate floor that was described as a thundering indictment of his party, his president, and his country's political culture. It was widely praised by progressives and moderates and was carried on all the major news networks. Senator Flake is now a political commentator and contributor to CBS News. Some of you saw him on CBS News this morning. You're ubiquitous in this area today. He will be this spring a guest lecturer at Princeton University, and next fall he'll be a resident fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. Leading tonight's conversation with Senator Flake is Deborah Schildkraut, professor of political science at Tufts. Professor Schildkraut's teaching and research focuses on American politics and political psychology. Some of her most recent work examines how the changing ethnic composition of the United States influences public opinion on a variety of topics. She is the author of Americanism in the 21st Century, Public Opinion in the Age of Immigration, Press One for English, Language Policy, Public Opinion, and American Identity, and The Challenge of Democracy, American Government in Global Politics. Professor Schildkraut is a proud jumbo who received her bachelor's degree from Tufts and returned to her alma mater after getting a PhD in political science from Princeton University and serving as assistant professor of politics at Oberlin College. I want to thank Debbie for leading tonight's conversation with Senator Flake, and I want to thank the senator and his wife, Cheryl, for joining us this evening. I know we're all looking forward to the senator's insights on his own career, on today's political environment, and on what to expect in the years ahead. Professor Schildkraut will kick off the conversation by asking Senator Flake a few questions, and then she'll open it up to audience questions. And I'm told that if you don't go to the microphone, you won't be able to ask your question because this is being live streamed, and then your questions won't be carried. All right? Please welcome Senator Jeff Flake and Professor Debbie Schildkraut.
Hello, welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you for...
This is intimidating to say.
Well, thanks for coming today. I have way more questions than I will have time to ask, so I'm just going to jump right in. But as Dean Solomont said, we'll be talking for maybe about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to you all, where we'll have microphones where you can go to ask your questions. And I guess if we could just start off with you telling us about when and why you first decided to run for office.
You know, I didn't grow up thinking that I would run for office. I grew up in the small town of Snowflake, Arizona. Yes, I'm a flake from Snowflake. My great-great-grandfather founded the town in 1878, and then somebody named Snow, Erastus Snow, came along. They called it Snowflake. So I grew up not knowing that flake was a pejorative term. Nobody made fun of us there. But my father was the mayor of Snowflake. My uncle Jake Flake from Snowflake was the Speaker of the House in Arizona. I have 10 brothers and sisters and 69 first cousins on my father's side alone. That's how I got elected. It does help. But I saw examples around me of public service, certainly from my family and from others that I respected, and grew up obviously in the shadow of people like Barry Goldwater, and was enamored of politics. And then when I went to South Africa and Zimbabwe, I fell in love with Africa politics, and then, as mentioned, was in the country of Namibia, the year that Namibia got its independence from South Africa. And to see a country write its constitution and have its elections, for a political junkie, that is nirvana. That's as good as it gets. And so I was hooked for life. And during that time also, I was able to really see from the perspective and from the eyes of those around the world what the United States has meant to the world. in terms of our greatest export, and that's liberal democracy. And I've been ever since that time in Namibia, feeling that it would be a great honor to give back in some way. And so in 2000, decided to run, and that was a tough thing. I love Arizona. It's not easy to get on a plane every week and go to Washington, but it was certainly the honor of a lifetime to serve this state of Arizona for 18 years.
So you mentioned being away from home as being a challenge. What else did you like best and least about serving in Congress?
Well, certainly what I like least is the travel, being away from family. We have 5 kids. I missed a lot of baseball games and piano recitals and other things. You just miss that. Fortunately, I have a wife who really picked up the slack and held down the fort well. So that's the tough part. And it's really changed, Congress has, in terms of this kind of thing. It used to be that when members of Congress were elected, they moved their family back to Washington. I was reading Mo Udall, a former congressman from Arizona, his journal in the 1960s, where he said, "We have enough money in our official budget to travel home 3 times a year." That's home to Arizona. So they were in Washington, and when they would move to Washington, they would move their children, and the children of Republican politicians would play ball and go to school with the children of Democratic politicians, and the families would recreate and worship and whatever on the weekends, and the bonds that they formed really overwhelmed the partisanship during the week. And you have found a level of trust that you just, it's tough to find today. There's an old saying that you'll never question your colleague's motives if you know the names of his children. And there's a lot of truth to that, and we've lost that. I don't think we can ever get it back. We are now a commuter Congress, where you go in Monday night or Tuesday night, depending on the week, and you're out of town and back home on Thursday night. Almost never fail. And it's really kind of tough. But that's the tough part, is traveling back and forth. The best part, obviously, is to be in the arena, to be there when big decisions are made, and to debate philosophy. I'd like to do it in a civil way, and to, if you don't do well in an election or the party doesn't, then you say, all right, how can we fashion our message better? How can we deliver our message better, instead of just trying to disqualify the other side somehow? And I mean, that's the part that I enjoy and that I miss already. There are a lot of good people in Washington on both sides of the aisle trying to do good things.
So speaking of how difficult it can be to do good things, and let's stick with your expertise in Arizona. As Dean Solomont mentioned, my area of research is on immigration and how people feel about issues related to immigration. And Arizona is ground zero. The border area is remote and rugged. According to the Washington Post, over 3,000 deaths have occurred in that region in the past 20 years of people trying to cross the border in that region. And I suspect there are a lot of people here who might be interested in hearing your thoughts on the recent declaration of a national emergency at the border, which would allow the president to reallocate funds so that, in part, he could construct a wall in areas along the border. So what are your thoughts about this situation?
Well, thanks. I grew up, as I mentioned, in a small town of Snowflake. I grew up on a cattle ranch. We employed labor, migrant labor. I should point out it wasn't illegal at that time to do so. But I grew up working alongside migrant labor from Mexico. They would tend to come across the border, work for a season, but there was no fence, there was no border really at all. The Border Patrol would sometimes pick them up, but just to give them a ride home for the season, or for birthdays or celebrations. And I'm not suggesting we can go back to that time. We can't now with national security concerns, but people tended to come across the border, work, and then return home. Now, after it became more difficult and expensive and dangerous to cross the border, then people would say, we're going to come, we're going to bring our family, and we're going to stay. And so what was a circular pattern of migration became a settled pattern that brought, untold different, consequences. So, but I grew up working with migrant labor, like I said, and I knew their motives, and I could never, when I got to Washington, look at those who had crossed the border illegally simply to work as a criminal class. And that's what motivated me to work on immigration reform in the House during my entire time there, and then particularly when I got to the Senate with the so-called Gang of Eight. And we passed what I still believe was a good piece of legislation. And when we do solve this issue, when we do get immigration reform done, I think that bill will be the guts of it, because those elements, border security, guest worker, temporary worker programs, mechanism to deal with those who are illegally here, those are all going to have to be part of the ultimate solution. But we're in a situation now on the southern border that it's a better situation than we've had in the past. There are different challenges. The composition of those coming across is different, but the numbers are far, far lower. In my view, the notion that this is a national emergency is a bit contrived because we've had situations that are worse. It definitely needs to be better. We do need, in certain areas, better barriers. The irony is, over the past several years, we have been changing out barriers, in most cases removing some things that approximate walls, which were kind of landing strips from the Vietnam War era that we would cement in the ground, and those were opaque and like a wall. They didn't work very well. You need to be able to see through. And so we've been replacing those on a schedule with fences for years. And a lot of what's going on now is just a continuation of that schedule that we're on. And if that needs to be accelerated, sure, do it. But this notion of what was conjured up during the campaign, and some people still see it as a brick and mortar wall, you'd be hard pressed to find any part of the 2,000-mile border that calls for that. So I am sympathetic, and in the so-called Gang of Eight bill, we provided more than $40 billion over a 10-year period for border security measures, barriers, manpower, technology. And so when the president says that Democrats don't want border security, they just want open borders, I remind him that every Democrat in the Senate voted for that package, which included $40 billion, more than the president has ever asked for border security. And so I think it just has to be packaged with other items that we desperately need, like more robust and modern temporary worker programs, commuter worker programs, and mechanisms to deal rationally and humanely with the illegal population that is here today.
And what do you think the prospects are for this happening?
Not good. I have to say, it used to be that when I was in the House, we were trying to push the DREAM Act, dealing with those who are here, who were brought across the border, median age of 2, I think, and had grown up here. That was the easy part, and we kept that and didn't pass it on its own because we wanted to couple it with some border security measures and high-skilled immigration issues, thinking that we'd do a big package. Nowadays, we can't do any one of those constituent items alone. It's too politically difficult. And so the prospects right now are not good. And I think we're going to kind of lurch from one crisis to another. I'm not discounting the problems we have on the border. They are serious and need to be better. But as we often point out, nearly half of those who are here illegally now didn't cross the border illegally. They came and have overstayed, and you just can't say we're going to solve it with one measure or one instrument like a wall.
So the Senate will be voting this week on whether or not to disapprove of.
And let me say, I don't even think that's a close call at all. If I were still in the Senate, I would vote for the disapproval resolution. We cannot. I just ask my Republican colleagues, if President Obama had suggested this, if he had declared a national emergency and tried to move money that you had appropriated through the regular appropriations process, would you stand for it? I don't think any of my colleagues would. And so we certainly shouldn't countenance it, just because we now have a Republican president doing it.
And I think there will be more Republican senators taking that position than we've seen going against Trump on many other issues or bills that he's wanted to advance. But I guess what's noteworthy and what I want to talk about next is this idea of criticizing the president and how difficult it can be in this day and age, not to engage with the other side, but also to criticize your own side, where it can be seen as a betrayal and that you have to be with your side on 100% of the issues, or you're not true enough to that side. I know this is something you've had to deal with and that you write about in your book. And I just wonder if you have advice for our students who may also maybe want to challenge some of the views on the side that they agree with most of the time, but don't always think is doing the right thing, and that criticism you get from people who are normally your allies.
Well, yeah, the nuance has kind of been taken out of politics. And the problem today, and this, there are many fathers to this problem, and those who just put all the blame on the president are wrong. It's long beyond that. The president, I think, has exacerbated it and taken advantage of the divisions, but a lot of it started before he came along. But today, all of the political incentives for elected officials, I can tell you, drive people to the extremes. On any big issue that comes along, whether it is debt and deficit or climate change or Kavanaugh or any big issue you can think of, gun policy, all the incentives are for public officials to immediately say where they are, to rush through their corner to their tribe and stay there. And don't indicate for a second that you might be open to change your mind, or that your vote might be informed by a hearing that you're chairing or an investigation that might be occurring. Because as soon as you do, as soon as you let that crack open, then you're hit from both sides. And I've lived in that space for the past 2 years, and it's not a comfortable place to be. And nobody wants to be in it, particularly if you're looking for re-election. It's tough enough when you're not, but if you're looking for re-election, to be in that space is tough. And that's why you see a decreasing number of elected officials, particularly in the Senate, who are willing to go there. And that will only change when those incentives change, and when politicians realize that people want something different, that they want their elected officials to govern, that it's okay to change your mind sometimes. It's okay to deliberate. The Senate has been known as the world's most deliberative body. That does not well describe the Senate right now, I can tell you.
So you did stand out as one of the Republicans who did routinely express displeasure at the actions and words of the president, but you may have also faced criticism from people who said maybe you didn't do enough while you had the chance, while you were in office. And so I think people here might want to know how you respond to that criticism.
Oh, sure. That's you'll never do enough for what the people on the other side of the aisle want. And I always hear a thing, oh, you voted with the president 85% of the time. I have to tell you, the lists that come out in the Senate, at least, 90% of what you deal with, particularly in the first 2 years of a new president, is the president's executive calendar, meaning judgeships, cabinet picks, other administration posts that you have to fill. And I've always been of the opinion that presidents get their due unless somebody is not qualified for the position, or there is something so completely out of the mainstream that would disqualify them. I voted for nearly all of President Obama's cabinet picks and his administration officials, and so that any of the lists you see out there are not indicative really of how people vote. A lot of things that I was very opposed to the president on like the Muslim ban, for example, which then in its current iteration is now the travel ban. There's never been any vote taken on immigration. There have been just a few. For one, he supported, and some of my colleagues introduced, the administration-favored bill in response to the DACA issue, which would have cut legal immigration by half, for example. And obviously, I oppose things like that when they come up. But you deal with so many of the president's executive agenda items that overall vote tallies don't reflect very much of what you vote on. But I have to say, I am a conservative. And on regulatory and tax policy, I believe in conservative principles that if you have a conducive tax and regulatory environment, you generally have a better economy. And we need a better economy to be able to compete in this world. And I was concerned at the end of the last administration that our regulatory and tax policy was not conducive enough, and that we were being left behind globally. Some of that has been corrected, but certain other things I am certainly not in favor of where the administration has gone.
So this doesn't sound like there are particular votes or things that you wish you had done differently as a way to express your displeasure with certain things the president has done.
No, and then let me say as well, some people will say, if you oppose the president and you don't want him to have a second term, and I don't, then it's incumbent on you to not give him any victories. Don't vote for anything that would, allow the president to have success. I just don't believe that. I don't believe that that's good policy. Mitch McConnell was roundly criticized when he made a comment after Barack Obama was elected that his job was to make sure he was a one-term president. You remember that? And I was critical of that as well. I don't think that that is our job. We want to see the president succeed. But for example, if you're to take the position that you don't want this president to have a success that will give him momentum to have bipartisan victories that would perhaps give him a second term, then should I have voted against criminal justice reform, which the president favored, but Congress had been working on for years? A group of us on the Republican side and the Democratic side, should we then say, because the president supports it, now we should reject it? And I don't believe so. So I try, I don't always succeed, tried to put country above party there. But there are always judgment calls you make in that regard. And sometimes I'm sure I haven't made the right judgment call, but I've tried to.
So I guess this next question digs down into this a little bit more. This question of country over party, and it seems like there are people who would make this case that you can't give him any victories because this enables him to be in a better position to get reelected. And if you think he shouldn't get reelected, then that's really important, because not only do people disagree with his policies, but they may see him do things that they think are antithetical to democracy. And so I have a list here, but I won't read them all, but it's things like calling the press the enemy of the people, applauding a member of Congress who beat up a reporter, calling white supremacists good people, using nicknames to people that degrade the quality of discourse in our society. And I have more things here, but I won't. But when people look at a list like that he lies routinely, say his support among partisans is 80%, 90% consistently, and is that putting party above country? Is being in power so important that these things that are not partisan but are essential to democracy are overlooked? At what point can you not overlook them anymore and want to deny him a victory?
Well, to deny him a victory, like I said, would that entail voting against criminal justice reform, which has been, a goal for liberals as well as some conservatives? I don't think so. I think that a time when we simply say, because we don't like the president, we're going to go vote against everything that he supports, whether it's tax policy that really Republicans have been working on for a long time, or, for example, I haven't been a fan of Obamacare. I think that there are better ways to reach universal coverage or better coverage. I had voted to repeal Obamacare about 34 times, I think, before President Trump was elected president. Then when he is elected president, should I now vote the other way because he is president and wants the same thing? I don't think so. I think if you want to remain true to your principles, you vote that way. But boy, when the president speaks out or calls the press the enemy of the people, man, every Republican ought to stand up and say no. I went to the Senate and gave a speech on the topic. And I mean, if you, and I've spoke against that many, many times, or these other things that you're mentioning, I think every one of those I've either spoken out firmly against and received a lot of criticism from the president on that. And in the end, for myself, I didn't support the president when he ran the last time. It went back for me to long before he ran for president, when he was just a citizen and he was weighing in a heavy-handed way on the president's birth certificate. And he was the head of the birther brigade. And I thought at the time, this was back in 2011 or 12, I thought anybody who believes that should not be president. Anybody who doesn't believe it but takes advantage of the fact that some people do. And I think that's the camp that the president is in. That's even more disqualifying. So I could never warm to the president. And then the comments he made about Mexicans and about my colleague John McCain and on and on and on. I just could never support him. I could have, I guess, when he was elected, said, all right, politics has changed. He's a populist. That means he's popular. I can hop on that bandwagon. But I couldn't do it. I had hoped that the electorate in Arizona would change and appreciate a senator who would act like a senator and say, I'll agree with the president when he's right, and I'll disagree and vote against him when he's wrong. But the party has really coalesced around the president, I think, to our detriment as Republicans. And I mean, even to go so far as to back candidates that the president would back, like Roy Moore of Alabama. I was so turned off by that I wrote a campaign check to his opponent, the Democrat. And then for me, in terms of re-election, I just felt in the end I could accept the president's policy positions that I don't accept, and I could condone behavior that I just can't condone. That would be the price to win a Republican primary in Arizona. And I felt in the end, I knew that I would have to stand on a campaign stage with the president when people are shouting, lock her up, and things that are antithetical to what I believe. And I just, in the end, I couldn't do that. And that's why I am where I am right now.
So I think I have time for two more questions before we turn it over. According to research here at Tisch College, we know that when campaigns prioritize contacting young people, they turn out to vote. It's actually true of anybody, not just young people. Mobilization works, we know this. During the 2016 election, however, 70% of youth reported no contact by a campaign or party. With millennials now making up the largest group of eligible voters in America, Generation Z entering the electorate quickly, why aren't parties investing more in young people? And what do you think is perhaps uniquely challenging for the Republican Party in this regard?
Well, I know Democrats have been making that a focus, and certainly the use of social media, Democrats have been far ahead of where Republicans are in terms of contacting and getting out there. I believe it's to our detriment as Republicans. Young people have been walking away from the party for a while. I think now they're in a dead sprint. When you look at things like climate change or others that Republicans, I think, haven't fessed up to and realized that we can do things, I think we're going to lose adherence. And when you look at demographics, obviously, if you're turning off 18 to 24-year-olds, you're not long for this world as a party. And I think that Republicans haven't fully digested the impact of the midterm elections. We held on to the Senate, and that was frankly because we had a very good map and the number of people up. But boy, if you look elsewhere, losing 40 seats, complete wipeout in states like Nevada or New Mexico, not one Republican representing Orange County in Congress. I mean, we ought to turn inward and say, we've got to do something different, and that has to involve contacting young people. It's impressive what Dean was talking about as to what you're doing in terms of figuring out what motivates, and it's contact. It's people being involved, and that's great. I hope you'll do more of it.
Oh, they will here, I'm sure. So I'll just use this as an opportunity to let you tell us about your most memorable moment in Congress.
Most memorable, that's 18 years, 12 in the House and 6 in the Senate. There are a lot of wonderful memories, but I have to say, when I first got to the House, I looked at one policy position on foreign policy that I just thought our party is wrong on, and that was Cuba. I always thought, Republicans have always preached the gospel of contact and travel and commerce and trade, that we can nudge countries toward democracy that way. But with Cuba, no, let's isolate them. and 50 years of that proved that it didn't work very well. So I joined up with Bill Delahunt from Massachusetts. We formed the Cuba Working Group. I had the silly notion that if you want to get rid of the Castro brothers, just make them deal with spring break once or twice. Just let Americans travel to Cuba. And I was able to pass legislation to do that a couple of times, but President Bush wouldn't sign it. And then by the time President Obama came in, he would have signed it, but then I couldn't pass it. And so it's kind of a quandary there. But I'd been traveling to Cuba. We tried to work around the edges, and President Obama gratefully took some action that he could by undoing previous executive orders, allowing Cuban Americans to travel as many times as they wanted and remit as much money to family members. And that created kind of an entrepreneurial class in Cuba that it now has some power. In fact, a few weeks ago, they flexed their muscles when the Cuban government tried to impose new restrictions on some of the entrepreneurs. They rose up and said, hey, no, and the government backed down, which is significant in Cuba. But we couldn't move much more on policy because the Cubans had taken an American by the name of Alan Gross and charged him as a spy. He was a USAID contractor, and he'd been in jail in Havana for 5 years and in not good shape. And I'd been down to visit him in prison there, and we'd been trying to secure his release, and he was in a bad way. He'd lost about 100 pounds in very poor health, and saying that he would take himself out if he wasn't released soon. And I went home and talked to the White House and said, if you're not negotiating for his release, you'd better hurry. And they had been. And 3 weeks later, the White House called and asked if I would undertake a sensitive mission that I couldn't tell my wife or my staff where I was going. I said, this is why I came to Congress. But I was asked if I could be with Pat Leahy, Democratic senator. We'd been working on this issue together. If we could be at Andrews Air Force Base at 5 a.m. on Wednesday. This was a Monday. And so we said, sure, and we got there. And there was one of the president's planes, and Judy Gross, Alan's wife, who we'd been working with on this issue, was on the plane. And another plane took off at the same time we did. It was to pick up a Cuban national who had been a spy for us 20 years before and had been in a Cuban prison. Another plane took off from Miami with 3 Cuban spies who'd been convicted and were in our prison. And we were to do a Cold War era prisoner or spy swap. This was in December of 2014. We landed in Cuba. Alan Gross was reunited with his wife. We were 3 separate airfields in Cuba where the planes landed. And I met quickly with the foreign minister. We went out to the tarmac and waited for the signal. All 3 planes had to take off at the same time. And 31 minutes exactly from the time we landed, we took off. And the most memorable moment I had came when we were about a half hour into the flight. The pilot announced, we've now entered U.S. airspace. And Alan Gross stood up and just shook his fists in the air and and then just breathed in and out several times and said, "Now I know I'm free." And it was just the most remarkable experience, and it just reminded me once again, after having spent time, years before overseas at the special country that this is, and what we mean to the rest of the world, and what we have to continue to mean in terms of an example of liberal democracy around the world. And we landed in Washington, and President Obama here and President Raul Castro in Cuba both announced at the same time we would have diplomatic relations, and we did, and was able to go a few months later with Secretary Kerry and raise the flag over the U.S. Embassy for the first time in 54 years. And so those things make it all worthwhile. Make dealing with Twitter and everything else worth it, almost, Cheryl, right? but thanks for asking that.
All right, well, I only got through about half my questions. I could keep going, but that would not be fair to all of you. So we do have 2 microphones in either aisle. So we'll open up the conversation to the audience. Please do go to the mic, and please speak in the microphones, not only so that everyone here can hear your question, but we're also live streaming this event so that people listening elsewhere can follow along. And also, because we suspect there will be lots of questions, please make sure to keep your questions short, respectful, to the point, and that they are actually questions. We thank you in advance for doing that so that we can hear from as many of you as possible. So while these guys are falling in line, why don't we start over here?
Hi, Senator. First of all, thank you so much for coming to speak tonight. Could you briefly speak to what you think the Republican Party has to offer young people in 2020?
Oh, boy. Well, one thing, the Republican Party has always been the party of fiscal responsibility, or that's what I always believed. That's the main tenet: fiscal responsibility, limited government, economic freedom, free trade, strong American leadership. That first tenet, fiscal responsibility, I think young people ought to be very concerned about where we are fiscally. We're at $22 trillion in debt. The president just released his budget request this week. Has $1 trillion deficits for the next several years. And that we can't go on that forever. I would like to say, and I hope the Republicans can offer a way out of that. Obviously, we have an improved economy now. That's a good thing. I hope also, and there are an increasing number of Republicans, I think, who do recognize that we need to do something with regard to climate change. And you have some Republicans, some of the elder statesmen like Jim Baker and George Shultz, and then some members of Congress even introducing, and I've introduced, for example, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I think that if we want to go after the problem, we really have to go after it. And so I hope that we can offer those things. And then in terms of, I think young people are concerned about their economic future, not just government programs, whether those will be around, that's a big concern, but whether we will have an economy that can compete around the world. And that used to be a given. We're where it's at, but I can tell you I'm concerned about our place in the world if we continue to eschew, trade agreements and let the world pass us by. So I would hope that Republicans can move on those issues, but I have to say, I say that with caution because that's not where the Republican Party is right now. And some of the principles or the values, I guess, that the president has put forward are more populist values that really don't reflect that. And so mine are more aspirational, I guess, as far as where the party is, and I do hope that we can return to that quickly. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator Flake. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate that you referenced the bill that you co-sponsored with Senator Coons on carbon taxation. I have a question for you. It appears your record on climate change took a shift toward the tail end of your career. How have your views on environmental protection and climate change developed after receiving over $300,000 from the oil and gas industries? and how have they changed as your career in the Senate has come to a close?
Well, thank you. I should point out that the carbon tax bill that I introduced in the Senate, the last bill I introduced there, was very similar to a carbon tax bill that I had introduced in 2008, I believe, in the House. So I felt for a long time that as a conservative and as one who believes in free markets, if you want less of something, you tax it. If you want less carbon, you tax it. But you do it in a revenue neutral way, and so you're not picking winners and losers in the energy economy. And what I opposed in the House was the cap and trade system, which did pick winners and losers and was so complex that I just don't think it followed the market very well. So in terms of receiving contributions from oil and gas interests, should note some companies like Exxon have even supported a carbon tax now. So you have some split in the major players in the energy economy. But I frankly have thought for a while that we've got to do this in an aggressive fashion, and a carbon tax certainly does that. But it wasn't just at the end of my Senate career. Like I said, I did it in the House as well. But thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Senator Flake. Thank you so much for coming here to speak. I really appreciated your critique of the hyperpartisan atmosphere that's developing in Washington. And my question relates to the future of America as a whole. Now, every empire has its rise and its fall. Do you consider the toxic combination of a hyperpartisan atmosphere in the Capitol and Trump's international doctrine as a possible terminal disease of the American empire?
Man. No, but I have to say, I mean, it's easy to have a dystopian view because sometimes politics is presented this way, that, it's just good versus evil, and one party's good, one's evil, and I just don't buy that. I don't think that we're there. When I got to the Senate 6 years ago, on the initiation, or the first night that we were there, we were taken to the National Archives to be able to see the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and some of the founding documents. And we even went in and were able to hold some of the draft cards, oaths of allegiance signed by soldiers, Revolutionary soldiers, and General Washington, and then relics from the Civil War and documents, during the time of women's suffrage, the movement. And I came out of that thinking, we have big problems today. This was 6 years ago. Our problems are a little steeper now, but they don't compare at all to some of the problems that we have dealt with in the past. Having a civil war, or a civil rights movement that should have come a lot earlier, but finally we dealt with, and women's suffrage, and those issues. We've faced bigger challenges and have dealt with them, bigger challenges that we have today. I do think that, like I said, it has to come from, the incentives have to change in order for politicians to change. And as soon as voters will value and place that value with their vote on people who will actually reach across the aisle and to admit that compromise is not a dirty word. I come from Arizona. We always, we revere Barry Goldwater, and a statement that he made was, that was it moderation in pursuit of, and extremism in pursuit of is no vice. This basically saying, here's a tough guy, principled. He also said, Barry Goldwater, something that people don't bring up much. He said once, politics is nothing more than public business. Sometimes you make the best of a mixed bargain. And that's been the case from the great compromise that really launched our country in terms of how the House and the Senate would be configured, to compromises along the way that have brought us to where we are. And as soon as the voters will value that and place their vote like that, then the incentives will change, and you'll have members of Congress, again, when they run for office, say, hey, my value, one, is I am principled. And one of those principles is that, this is a legislative body, and sometimes it involves compromise. And so I think that we can get through it. It's tough to see right now, but there are good people in Washington on both sides of the aisle trying to do the right thing. There are some that are trying to pull us apart. Value those, get behind those, work for those, elect those that are trying to pull us together. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, thank you for joining us. My name is Adham Sahlul. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy here at Tufts. I'm a first-generation Syrian American from Chicago, and I'm actually getting married this June to a Syrian American from Phoenix, Arizona. So yes, we're everywhere.
Move to Phoenix, please.
Yes, that's the plan. I'd be crazy not to mention that this week is the anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, and in a free and democratic Syria, there would have been a boulevard named after the late great Senator John McCain for his support of the Syrian people. And on behalf of the Syrian American community, I want to thank you for your support against the Muslim ban, the xenophobic, Islamophobic ban that this president enacted in his first year in office. So my fiancée Diana and I are co-founders of a hummus company called Little Aleppo. It hires Syrian refugees to produce authentic organic hummus. It's a market solution to the economic and social integration of refugees in this country. And we're actually finalists in the Tufts 100K startup competition, by the way. So show your support on April 5th.
This guy's good.
My question is, from speaking as an entrepreneur or now a new entrepreneur, how can average citizens, in the private sector, in their day-to-day lives, help regain this civility that, as you describe, has so eroded in the Trump era and perhaps even before? And shamelessly, I'll ask, are there any business partners in Washington and Arizona who I should reach out to?
You're really good. You got to run for office. What you got to do? No, well, boy, just tell your story. I mean, the people need to know, and need to be reminded. It seems, particularly when people devalue the contributions of immigrants and refugees, and how that has enriched our society and brought us to who we are. And just continue to tell your story, your wife's story, and others. That's what I hope we can do. I mean, this, and you ask what you can do. All of you are on social media. I tell people my age, change the channel. Every once in a while, whatever you're watching, whether it's MSNBC all day or Fox all day or CNN, change the channel to CBS, because I'm on there now. No, that's not it. No, whatever you're watching, and for kids your age, is just get out of your news feed and recognize that people see things differently. They aren't evil, and when you comment, and when you, just every once in a while, something uplifting to a member of Congress or whatever, or make sure there's something good out there. Let me just say that a while ago, a Democratic congresswoman who was just elected in a campaign event that became public, used a very vulgar, crude term to say that the president ought to be impeached. I thought that was unfortunate, and since I've been very critical of the president and his use of vulgarity and crudeness in referring to his opponents, I thought that I would say something, so I just tweeted out, words like this have no place in politics. Just because the president speaks this way gives us no excuse to do so. Within 2 days, there were 30,000 comments on that post. And I'm ashamed to say that the overwhelming majority of them were to the effect that the president speaks this way, and so must we. And that's, one, it speaks to the awesome power of the presidency and what a poor example can do in terms of the political discourse and civility. But we have to all do our part, particularly those in elected office, to model better behavior and to realize that what you say in any event, whether you think it's private or not. If it degrades the political discourse, don't do it. We can't afford that anymore. But thank you. Thanks for the question.
So it pains me to say this. I'm told we have time for 2 more questions. So one over here and one over here. Thank you.
Hi, Senator. I have a question about your conscience and consistency. You openly expressed concerns about the, quote, staggering national debt, but then you voted for the tax bill that added trillions of dollars to that debt. Even putting aside the sexual assault allegations, you described Brett Kavanaugh's, quote, sharp and partisan interactions with the Senate Judiciary Committee, adding, quote, we can't have that on the court. You then voted to confirm him to the court. You denounced President Trump many times, and in your speech on the Senate floor in October 2017, you said you have, quote, regret for the compromise of our moral authority and our complicity in this alarming and dangerous state of affairs. And yet you voted with Trump over 80% of the time, according to 538, which does not take into account the smaller things that you were discussing. How do you reconcile these discrepancies between your words and your deeds?
What was the first part again? Let me get What was the first part of it?
About the national debt.
National debt. Yes. The tax bill that we did, we have been in desperate need of corporate tax reform to lower our corporate rate to make sure that we're in line with where the world is for a long, long time. Had it been my preference, I wouldn't have done an individual tax cut at all. I would have just done the corporate tax relief because we have to be competitive. If we are not competitive globally, we don't grow. Unfortunately, to make it politically popular enough among Democrats and Republicans to pass, you have to sweeten it up with individual tax, marginal rate cuts. There are supply side effects to tax cuts if you do the right ones. With corporate tax cuts, you've got to do that to stay competitive. I would argue lowering the rate from 39.6 to 37 doesn't do that. So that wouldn't have been my preference, but it was part of a package that we needed to be competitive globally. That's why I voted for that. I do think that in terms of revenue over 10 years, if we have a more conducive tax and regulatory environment, that will far more than eclipse the lost revenue from the tax cut. Regulatory policy does even more in that regard. With regard to, let's see, what was it?
Kavanaugh.
Oh, Kavanaugh. With regard to Kavanaugh, there was some people will put that out as well. This is the president's nominee. If you pose the president, you shouldn't approve his nominees. The president knew Brett Kavanaugh all of about 2 weeks before he was nominated. Brett Kavanaugh, nobody questions his credentials. He was a circuit court judge for 10 years with an impeccable record. The question came up with the allegation that came forward. I felt, and I said that I wouldn't vote to advance his nomination from the committee unless Dr. Ford was heard. She was. Then my party's argument that an FBI investigation wasn't needed, I didn't think held water. There was no reason we couldn't do an FBI investigation. And so I insisted on that. Teaming up with Chris Coons to make sure that that happened. It did happen. I don't want to get in the habit of making background checks public. They shouldn't be, or nobody would submit themselves to them. But I wish the country could have read the report. I think that the country would feel better about where the Senate landed in this regard. And in terms of Brett Kavanaugh's behavior before the committee, I didn't like it. I thought that we ought to expect more than that. But then you also think of how, if you felt that you had been unjustly accused, as he felt he had, how you would act. Would you lash out? And then you weigh that against his 10-year record on the court and talk to his colleagues, which I did. You talk to his clerks, which I did. The plaintiffs who appeared before him, you couldn't get one who had dealt with him over 10 years who would say that he was anything less than completely decent on the court and his record. And so you weigh those items when you make choices like this. So I have to say that I was glad that I did what I did in terms of insisting on an investigation, and I felt that it was the right thing to do for the Senate and for the country. But thank you.
I'm too short for this microphone. So you and Senator Romney are two of the only and most vocal, I guess, criticizers of the president, and you're both also notably members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Utah, which is very red and very Mormon, voted unprecedentedly for Evan McMullin in 2016. I was wondering if you could just speak to the role that your faith has played in your politics and your principles.
Well, thank you. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I have, and obviously everybody's faith, no matter what that is, will influence how they feel, what their values are, and I don't hide that at all. And my church, my faith teaches me to be decent. It teaches me to be involved in civic life, and to try to make communities better, and to uphold the values and standards that we ought to uphold. So I hope that I'm influenced by that, and I think in terms of I mean, we as members of the church do believe that we ought to treat people well. Not every, I think members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints skew more Republican than Democrat, but there are wonderful members of the church who are Democrats who I have worked with well. Harry Reid, there's another right now from Utah, and I hope that there are more of them coming up. And I've tried to do justice to my faith by being in Congress. Nobody in my church will ever tell me how to vote. That's not how it works. They just say, let your conscience be your guide, and I've tried to live up with that the best that I can. So, but thank you.
All right, well, I think we are calling it a night. So thank you so much for your time and for entertaining our questions today. It's been a true pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me here.